Hello, welcome to Jewish Culture and Jewish Awareness. My name is Dustin Hausner. I'm the Jewish Outreach and Program Director at the Wayne YMCA. All our Jewish programming is funded through the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. So today we're going to talk about a very interesting subject with a very talented artist. This is a subject that gets brought up quite a bit, and when I saw this person's just pure artwork and designs, I knew I wanted to speak to this person, and I thought it would be an interesting conversation topic to have with you today. So it is my great pleasure to introduce tattoo artist Gabriel Wolf. Gabriel, it's so great to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. So let me ask you, well, first, can you actually tell us a little bit about yourself, where you come from, what you do, that sort of thing?
Yes. Um, I'm a calligrapher. More than being a tattoo artist or a tattooist,
Mm.
I'm a calligrapher. I'm busy with Hebrew letters for most of my life. I started when I was 5 for some reason, and I've been doing the same thing for the last 33 years. No, I um, I grew up in Munich, or at least I spent quite a few years when I was a kid in Munich. But then we moved to Jerusalem when I was still a kid. This is where kind of when people ask me where I am from, Jerusalem is where I am from. And I left Israel at some point. I moved to the Netherlands. I lived there for 5 years. I lived in Buenos Aires for 5 years, and now I live in Berlin. Um, so kind of I've experienced different places in which being Jewish is very different.
Mm. Well, I mean, can you talk a little bit about that? Why you feel that it's different in regards to the feeling of Jewish identity?
Absolutely. The thoughts I have about Jewish identity have a lot to do with tattoos, and they have a lot to do with this move from Europe to Israel and then back to the diaspora.
Okay.
Um, I sometimes tend to say it is impossible to be a Jew in Israel. Like out of all the places in the world, the one place where you cannot be a Jew
Huh.
is Israel. Of course, that's an exaggeration, but there's something fundamentally different between being a Jew in the diaspora as a minority
Hmm.
and being a Jew in Israel, which kind of gets morphed into being an Israeli. And these are two things that are fundamentally different. When we're talking about Judaism, we're talking about rabbinical Judaism. And rabbinical Judaism is a philosophy that developed in the diaspora. And being in the diaspora, being the minority, is kind of inherent to that philosophy, to that way of life. It can be, there are different expressions of that nature
Hmm.
of Judaism, of the Jewish philosophy, but they all come back to we are the minority and there's a majority around us. In Israel, that's impossible.
Hmm.
So there is one answer, which is the ultra-Orthodox answer, which is creating a minority within a Jewish majority and kind of living the same way as they used to do in Europe, but in Israel, seeing the others, the other Jews as the other in Sartre way, like being defined by the secular or Masorti
Yeah.
Jewish majority. And then there's the secular or Masorti Jewish Israeli way, which is kind of disregarding um, what made us Jews for many centuries
Hmm.
and becoming Israeli. And that was the Zionist idea in the beginning,
No,
not being Jewish anymore, but being Hebrew or Canaanite or something like that.
no, I appreciate you sharing your views and perspective on that. I think it's very interesting, and it goes very well into the next questions, which goes into obviously your tattooing and the very interesting work you do. So I mean, I know you talked about briefly just now with when you were very little, but why specifically tattooing? What got you interested in tattooing?
Um, I was never really interested in tattooing. Like I was interested in calligraphy. And for a little while, I worked as a scribe, but kind of my urge to be creative made it hard to me to, stay confined to that profession. And I started painting and drawing and just generally exploring calligraphy in a more playful way. And at some point when I was, I don't know, maybe 17 or something, people started asking me for tattoo designs.
Interesting.
Um, Now, for me, that was just another canvas. I didn't really care about tattoos as such. It was a more exciting canvas because, of course, you know, somebody who tattoos your art is really, really committed. That's a huge ego boost, no? I'm 17 at that point. And then it's a little bit prohibited, and it's a little bit sexy. So, I'm 17 at that point. I'm super excited about it, but I didn't care about tattooing as such. What the point at which I started being interested in Jewish tattooing
Yeah.
was much later. And after I already moved back to Europe,
Mhm.
I remember that point. I remember a conversation with a client on the phone. Zoom wasn't a thing back then. Skype, I think, wasn't a thing back then. And they told me their story. I already had a name then as a calligrapher who would turn stories into art.
Mm.
And so they told me their story, and suddenly I understood that there's something that connects all the stories that I had heard that month or that year. I noticed that what connects them is something that I'm busy with as well. And that is the point we had before. All the stories were an expression of a quest for a secular Jewish identity.
Mm.
And why secular? I think it's clear. No, we're talking about tattoos. Jewish. No, we're talking about Hebrew calligraphy. So obviously, most of my clients were and still are Jews. And then tattooing is always about identity. It's always an expression of identity. So we have this attempt at the expression of a secular Jewish identity. And back then, 15 years ago or something like this, it was an attempt that came from the fringes of the Jewish collective. But by now, I mean, we're having this conversation, it kind of reached the mainstream.
Yeah.
And that process is what I'm really interested in. Not so much like tattooing is an expression of that process, but the process itself, I think it's super interesting. It's my process. It's the process of our generation. It's not just a process of secular people, but it's a process of redefining Jewish identity, because Jewish identity has become kind of vague in a way that I think historically was never the case. It was like Jewish identity was always defined, maybe, in different ways over the centuries, but it was always clearly defined. And I believe that maybe these days, today, in our generation, it's the first time ever that there's an ambiguity to Jewish identity. The things that used to define Jewish identity have kind of lost their power. It used to be mainly about a legal status, and then it used to be mainly about a religious identity in the 19th century when Orthodoxy appeared and the Reform movement appeared. There's a great book about that by Liora Batnitsky. And then you have Zionism clearly defining the Jewish collective in the 20th century. And of course, why is Zionism so clearly defined? Because Zionism is the answer to Hitler. So, there's no space for ambiguity. And nowadays, we are in a situation where there is space for doubt. Zionism has lost its force in kind of as a unifier of all Jewry. And I feel a little bit confusion around this theme of defining Jewish identity, or how Jewish identity is defined. And so there's space for confusion, but as well for creativity, individual answers, more individual answers. And I think Jewish tattooing is kind of an expression of that ambiguity and of that space for creativity.
It's interesting how you're explaining it, in the sense of, obviously, the multi-dimensions of different people's interpretations of what is their Jewish identity, or what is their secular / Jewish identity, and how that operates. And obviously, as you mentioned, your own personal views when it comes to just the Zionists and the different movements and things like that. One thing that was a reason I certainly wanted to speak to you in regards to not just the idea of Jewish tattooing, and as you mentioned, your focus is obviously calligraphy. When you look at your artwork, and I know you have an example you can show in a moment, when you look up, if someone went on Google right now and looked up Jewish tattoo, they'll see maybe a bit of Hebrew. They'll see, maybe it'll say the word kosher and done in the way that's kind of Hebrew lettering. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. What you've done that I find so fascinating is it reminds me of any real Jewish artwork I would see in like a synagogue or anything else. Like you've done it in a manner where it's, obviously we mentioned that's a tattoo, but it has that Jewish spirit to it, if that makes sense. Like you've done a very good job of being able to do the artwork where if someone looks at it, like you feel a Jewish presence, like your ability to use Jewish lettering, the Hebrew, some of the symbolisms like the dove, it's, to me, it's something I've never seen before, which I think is very unique. And again, I would love if you feel comfortable with it, showing the picture that I know you have, just to give an example of concept. Again, obviously we'll talk about your website for people who want to look into more detail, but just conceptually what I'm talking about, because I think it's very interesting what you do.
Let me show that in a moment, but what you said actually made me think of something that I never thought that I never had before, not in this way, and that is I feel that this, what you said, there's a Jewish spirit in all of my art, and of course there is. I think this is mainly thanks to me being fed stories about Jewish identity on a daily basis. Like each work you ever saw is an expression of somebody's story about Jewish identity. So it's not just kind of my endless creativity or my endless inspiration. It's that I'm being fed other people's stories all the time. This is kind of this is how I work. The work that I thought maybe worth showing is this. It's the word love, ahava, and I feel that it's almost not. This is actually almost not a Jewish work, because love is a creative force, mainly in Christianity. But when you think about what letters are to Jewish culture or to Jewish history, then what I think about mainly is how all the Jews in history, at least the male Jews until the 20th century, the male Jews knew how to read. This is something super unique. And hence letters became much more significant than just symbols for communication. You have in early Jewish mysticism, you have one book called Sefer Yetzirah, in which it is described how the world was created by letters. And I think that idea that letters are kind of the atoms of creation, I think that is something that it's unique and it's omnipresent in Jewish thought. You find that thought as well in non-Jewish philosophy, but you kind of go back to a Jewish feeling of creation, if you will,
Yeah.
if you stick to letters. And I kind of religiously stick to working only with letters.
Well, I was going to say, you know, a lot of concepts of Kabbalah as well as Jewish meditation, like there's such a depth of, you know, importance to the Jewish letters and their meaning,
Yes.
their emotions, and their connection to the greater universe and such. So it is very powerful what you're talking about. And again, I think that was obviously a good example of it, but you know, you have such a variety of different ways you've done the Hebrew lettering in such a artistic manner that, I mean, yes, they are tattoos, but they're also, they speak, I guess is putting it. No, and I say this
Thank
in
you.
a nice way, but I'm curious because you mentioned it. Obviously, you do the work based on these stories you tell by mainly Jewish clients, and this wasn't something you like grew up with doing. It kind of is something that over time through just your life experiences you got involved with. I'm curious, why is Jewish tattooing become such a phenomenon and an interest? Because, you know, growing up, and we'll talk more about this in a bit, but, you know, I think like many Jews, you're told, you know, you don't get a tattoo, you can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery, you know, obviously there's stigma behind it. But I've seen more and more Jews in the last number of years getting tattoos than, you know, I've ever heard of previously. And I find it really interesting. I'm curious, what are your thoughts as someone who's literally in the front lines working on it?
I think it really comes back to that kind of confusion around Jewish identity, and hence the artistic space or the creative space that opens with it. It's as well the distance from the Holocaust. The Holocaust for uh, tattooing was kind of, or let me put it this way, after the Holocaust,
Yeah.
this kind of minor offense of getting tattooed, something that is prohibited in rabbinical Judaism, but as a minor offense, it's like shatnez, it's like mixing garments.
Hmm.
Yes, it's forbidden, but I don't know if you are aware of what your garment is made of. It's just, you know, it had become an irrelevant prohibition, an irrelevant law. After the Holocaust, it became reinforced, and then we have this you know, the 20th century or the second half of the 20th century, which is in for Jews all defined by the Holocaust. And now with the survivors disappearing, this link between tattooing on one hand and Holocaust on the other is slowly disappearing. And there's another thing that is changing, which actually has not much to do with Judaism, and that is tattooing used to be defined by class.
Yeah.
Tattooing was like a thing of sailors and prisoners, no? And of course, as a Jew, you, at least for, you know, centuries, you would go out of your way in order to not being identified with the lower class or with criminals. And so for Jews, it was even more important to not be tattooed. Those two things are changing, and hence the option to get tattooed as a Jew.
So, I mean, well, first of all, I think that's a very interesting way of thinking about it because I think for many people, at least in these generations, it's very enforced not getting tattooing. But I think your point is very interesting of how it may have seemed as a minor bad thing to do, but because of the impact of the Holocaust and obviously the horrors and the ramifications of what happened to the survivors and those that died, that then became a reinforcement mechanism to not get tattooed, you know, out of respect or however it is felt. And now that, you know, a lot of the survivors are passing away, and also just in general, not having to do with Judaism, but the booming, you know, tattoo becoming, you know, the TV shows, the conventions. I mean, it is big around the world. The documentaries, the celebrities, you know, it's just a very big thing right now. So, you know, I think there's a number of different components, but it's an interesting perspective. So let me ask, you talked about a lot of your stuff is mainly focused on lettering. Do you have any particular type of designs you like to do? I mean, again, I realize you have clients that say what they want to do, but as the artist itself, you have the ability to say yes or no, or to, you know, how you interpret it. So I'm curious if there's specific designs you like doing.
Yes, yes. There are. So when I come to a work, when I conceptualize a
Yeah.
work, I try to. I think in layers. There's the text,
Mhm.
and then there is the form. And the more complex this tension is between text on one hand and form on the other, the more interesting the work. No, there's a text just like in a book. There's no tension, but then the more creative it becomes, the more tension you build up, and there is kind of an end point of that creation, of that creativity, and that is when you create a real life object with letters. So it can be anything. Can be an animal, or a building, or a person, um, and or an organ. Um, and the tension between the text on one hand and the real life object on the other contains the story. So one of the examples I like to give, because it happens a lot, is survivors of sexual assault asking for an artwork to get it tattooed, and often the text is about the assault. The text is about the problem,
Mm.
and the form is about the solution. So the form may be, for example, be a phoenix, and you have this text by itself forming the solution, forming an answer to the hardship. This to me is kind of the what I like to do most. It is, well, the most complex thing to do and the most time consuming, but it's the deepest form to me as a calligrapher. It's the deepest form of expression with letters.
Interesting. So, I'm curious, have you ever gotten pushback for the type of tattooing you do? Because again, I get, no, because obviously because of what we just said and kind of the stigma of it, have you had someone who, learned what you did and sent like a nasty email, or just, I can't imagine this, but just as the humor person, you do a tattoo and then a mom sends you a nasty email being like, why did you do this to my son? But, but I'm genuinely curious. Have you ever gotten much pushback on it, or has it mostly just been a positive experience? I'm curious.
I have to say it has been more positive than you would expect. But yes, of course, there is constant pushback. Less and less, less and less. But yes, there's constant pushback. Moms who mail me angry, no, not so much. But first of all, what is maybe more surprising is there's an embarrassing amount of anti-Semitic hate mails.
Hmm.
That's the first thing. Once you're out there in the public space as a Jew, expect anti-Semitism to be omnipresent, to be constant. But like internally, Jewishly,
Yeah.
yes, all the time. Um, we were looking for a place to put an exhibition about Jewish tattooing in Germany 2 years ago, I think. And all we needed was one rabbi working in Germany to say it's okay to put this exhibition out there. Not it's okay to get tattooed. It's okay to talk about it. It's okay to discuss the issue of Jewish tattooing. And we didn't find a single rabbi who would do that. So yes, there's a lot of pushback. There is a lot of lack of acceptance. But once again, I see this as a process. 15 years ago, it was really just fringes, people who had already found themselves at the fringes of the Jewish collective, and who would ask me for works.
Mhm.
And these days, my clients are, there's no real profile. They're Jews, but they're rich and they're poor. They're men and women. I have rabbis who have my tattoos, who have my art tattooed. One of the rabbis of Temple Emmanuel in Manhattan is tattooed.
Oh, wow.
It's really becoming mainstream. So I think this pushback, will last for a little longer, but it's about to disappear. This is a change. This is a process that is to stay with us.
Wow. So, no, I mean, you're right. Unfortunately, when it comes to the anti-Semitism, anytime you are very open Jewish, depending on the environment, and but I'm glad to hear that there's obviously been some positive input. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to do what you do if there wasn't.
Yes.
But so let me ask, because obviously things are a bit different. All over the world, we have the pandemic, different stages of it, depending on where you're located, which we're not going to get into. But I am curious how that has affected your business, because also what your business does physical tattooing to people, but you also sell, to my understanding on the website, the actual like the actual art of it. So I'm
Yes.
curious if you could explain not only how the pandemic has affected your business, but explain what your business actually does, because it's very unique.
So there's me as a calligrapher. I do my own work, regardless of clients or not clients. I do sell that. I paint on canvases. I draw on paper. That has the pandemic had no effect on that, because people are able to buy art online without any problem. Regarding the tattoo business, yes, there has been a huge change, but not for worse. The tattooing business itself, it has been like not mine, but generally the tattooing scene
Yeah.
has been hit hard, especially in the US.
Yeah.
Parlors, even big parlors, have been shut down, can't pay their rent, have to move out, can't look for a new place until the pandemic is over. So we're not in a good place regarding that. But people who commission art, they're not commissioning art out of a sudden urge. They're thinking about it, and the process people are going through when commissioning my art is long. It's like several emails, and then I talk to them over Zoom, and then they have a month. They wait for it for months. So these are people who really have considered it, who really thought about it. And there's never been a period in my life where people had more time to think about it than now. So a lot of people who mail me now kind of say, I had this in my mind for years. I'm following your work for years. And now I had the time to sit down and say, okay, this is what I want. This is what this tattoo should be about. I'm happy with it. No.
I'm sure you are. Uh, no, but it's interesting because I think, especially in the American lexicon, when people think of tattoos, they think of you go into a parlor, it's people in like leather jackets and rock and roll music, and it's the mother heart with the arrow, and the like those type of things. But in reality, there are many specialized artists like yourself, if I may call you that, who take time with their clients, who it's a good amount of money, but you form a relationship to an extent. You really go through what the artwork is meant, what it's supposed to be. Like there's a larger, more I think professionalized process than people give credit for, which is very interesting.
Absolutely. It's not it like any stigma. There's some truth to what you just described, like leather jackets and
I'm
flash
not
tattoos.
bashing it. Look, I'm not bashing it. I think it's a very specific mindset many people have for what.
Absolutely, absolutely. It used to be that way.
Yeah.
Until 20 years ago, parlors used to be that way, and there's still in some parts of the world there's still that attitude, like never try to mail a tattooist. He will not, or they will not reply. Don't call them. But there, next to that attitude, there's, for the last 15-20 years, there's a highly professional kind of branch of tattooing that is growing and taking over that world, which is the most important thing is that everything is sterilized and hygienic, and customer service is amazing. And yes, it's not cheap, but at the same time, it's kind of a high-end service that you're buying. There are big parlors who have reached the absolute mainstream, for example, in New York, in Miami, in LA.
Yeah.
So tattooing can be dirty and underground, but most of it is just highly professional.
So this will be a very basic question, but I do want to ask it. So obviously there's a huge difference between tattooing a human person and a canvas or a piece of paper or things like that. For those who have not gotten tattooed, or for people who have been curious but are terrified because they think it's gonna to just destroy them physically. The example I keep hearing is it feels like a bee stinging a sunburn. What is the difference process for you for actually tattooing a physical person, and what is the pain threshold? Because if I'm not mistaken, on your arm, I don't think those are done by magic marker. I'm just
I wish. How painful is it? It hurts. It hurts. It's not easy, but as well, it's a process. An historical process as well, because like in a dirty underground kind of setting, you used to have like machines that would make a lot of noise and would hurt as hell. And these days, machines like tattooing machines can be really silent, and I mean, it still hurts. It's still a needle, but it's much less painful than you would probably assume. I got this done actually in Berlin before I moved to Berlin.
oh,
And I was here for like one night, and the tattooist I had been following for ages was here for one night, and we had to have it done that night. And so the tattooing session lasted 8 hours, I think. And for the first 2 hours, I was okay. And for until hour number 4, I was surviving. And then it started hurting like hell. So yes, it can hurt. But most sessions don't last for more than 4 hours. 4 hours is kind of the threshold. Like you can bear it. You can bear the pain for 4 hours. After that, it's becoming unpleasant. But generally, let's put it this way. I've never heard of anybody who has abandoned a tattoo session in the middle just because it was too painful. It's bearable, definitely.
So let's ask obviously our focus has been tattooing, but as you mentioned, you're a calligrapher, you do your own beautiful artwork outside of tattooing. What are the best places for people to find your work or to find you? What are the best places?
Online, just Google Hebrew tattoos or Google my name. I have Instagram, I have a website. I'm present on Facebook. Just, type in Hebrew tattoos and you'll find me by Google.
So I'll wrap up with asking you, not encouraging people to get tattoos, because, whoever is watching this, you have a right to your own views and decisions on this matter, like anything else. But I'm curious for you, if anyone's interested in learning about Jewish tattoos or looking at your specific art and seeing, having a broader idea of what Jewish artwork and what Jewish tattooing can be in like the styles you do, for example, how would you, I would say, address that? How would you talk to people about that? What would be your message to them?
Jewish spirit has always been defined by change. We tend to think about Jewish spirit as this non-changing set of values. But if you think about Jewish thoughts, it's mainly a thought defined by clashes and paradox. This is, Talmudic. So a world that is changing demands a changing Judaism. And so I think that Jewish tattooing will have a place in Jewish future, a central place. So don't be hold back. Don't let old values and old assumptions hold you back if this is your way of expressing your Jewish identity.
Well, Gabriel, I want to thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with us. And again, I think this was very much a learning for a lot of people. I hope people will go onto your website, look up the work you do. And for everyone out there, I want to wish you to be safe, be healthy, be well. Gabriel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
You too.